really focuses on this idea of resilience as the capacity to live with and develop with change. And it's especially the capacity to deal with uncertainty, which I think is especially relevant to these turbulent times that we're living in today. And maybe just to add to that, I think it's really, in terms of that capacity, it's really about this ability to prepare for, learn from, and navigate uncertainty, surprise, and shocks, but also to potentially transform the way that we live and do things where that is needed to address some of the challenges we face.
Thanks, Unzi. Just to develop a bit on that, I mean, is there ways to make the resilience concept, which is quite nebulous in some cases, people have criticized in that way, to make it a bit more operational? I'm thinking of, can it be narrowed down to a few key principles or attributes that can make it easier if we want to operationalize it?
I think that's very much the direction that the field is developing, and over maybe even the past 10 years, there have been different attempts to distill some kind of key underlying principles for building resilience in complex systems. And the work that Albert mentioned in this kind of latest collaboration is drawing on a lot of this previous work and syntheses, and specifically thinking from a more operational standpoint. We've identified 5 key attributes for building resilience, and maybe I'll just go through those briefly. So the first one is diversity, and this is really at a broad level, kind of thinking about having different options for being flexible in the face of change, and the ability to respond in different ways to shocks, surprises, and ongoing change. That it's also an important source of innovation, especially in cases where one maybe needs more transformative change to deal with challenges being faced. The second attribute is redundancy, and actually diversity and redundancy work very closely together. But redundancy really refers to the capacity to have different ways of achieving the same thing, especially critical kind of system functions. So, I mean, in the face of COVID, it's also about having maybe more than one way that kind of critical healthcare can be delivered, especially if certain services or functions fail. What are the backups, in a sense? The third principle is, or attributes, is around connectivity, and this has been shown to be really critical, especially in the kind of increasingly hyper-connected world that we live in today. But connectivity is not a simple attribute or principle, and it's really about having a balance between having good levels of connection but not being over-connected. And so when you have some good levels of connection, for instance, if there's a drought or a flood in a particular place, and you've got connections to other places, they can be a source of recovery or providing kind of key resources that have maybe been wiped out in your area. But on the other hand, if your system is over-connected, then a shock that hits in one place, say the COVID virus, can rapidly spread all over the world. So it's really about that balance between connectivity and modularity. Then the fourth attribute, and this is actually one that's maybe a little bit new compared to some of the previous work that's been done, but that which we propose in our most recent work, is around inclusivity and equity. And I think this is really a key item that's becoming a very high priority on many agendas for thinking about development in the future. But I think it's really important in terms of, or we show that it's really important in terms of being able to build the trust and collective action for responding to change. And that where we have highly unequal societies, it's actually more difficult to maintain stability and also to actually implement, in some cases, policies that can address sudden shocks. And then the final attribute that we identify in this most recent work is around adaptive learning. And this is particularly important in the context of these complex, adaptive, changing, and rapidly evolving systems that we live in today. And that's really around having the capacity to detect changes, learn from them, and then adjust management and policy in response to that, and sometimes in quite a quick iteration. And this is especially if the conditions that maybe you've designed policy around have changed, and then you need to be able to then adapt that, detect that, and incorporate it in policy again to account for those changes.
Thanks, Unzi. Thanks so much. Nisha, I have a question to you. There's many policy actors, the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, big policy players are making commitments around resilience recovery to make it, around COVID-19 recovery, to make it resilient, right? You see that in different documents and in different commitments being made. Is that a good or a bad thing? How do you see it?
Hey everyone, thanks Albert for that question and for having me. I mean, I think first of all, a very provocative question, and sort of the dichotomy, whether this is good or bad, but I think in general, this is probably a good direction for us to be in. One, as Unzi just mentioned, there are many definitions of resilience out there, and despite the fact that it's sort of overused and underdefined, it's just that at least policy actors are actually considering this, right? Whereas it used to be that we needed to have only economic growth, right? There was a very distinct thought around, well, what is the world going to look like in the future? And with resilience actually included, then there is actually room for a discussion about, well, what does ecosystem resilience look like? What does social resilience look like? What does equity and diversity look like in this new world? And so in that sense, it opens the door for that discussion to happen. And you're absolutely right that they all have different versions of resilience and different definitions, but that's partially because they all have a certain look into the sort of the global agenda, right? So whether if that's the FAO, then it's very much focused on food systems, whereas if it's the IMF, then it's financial systems or general economies. But I think it opens the door for, again, countries and for other partners to actually push for a definition that works best for them, which is the flexibility, I think, concept that Unzi was going for. So I do think that this is generally a good thing, and for us to think about what a recovery looks like in the future that actually works for people rather than institutions. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Nisha. Just building a bit on that, I mean, do you see any case where, bad or unresilient investments can be made under the guise of resilience? I mean, are we seeing anything of that, or is it something we should be worried about?
I mean, I think if we look at what the stimulus packages have come out so far in the last sort of 8 to 10 months, I do think that we do quite a lot of emergency support in the first realm. And, a lot of that is social safety net programs, right? Which is exactly what we need at this point in sort of the current situation. But I do think that there is, in general, this fear that we will be locking into the same investments that we've made, because that's where our sort of preparation has been, right? So for the infrastructure projects that have generally been coal-oriented or whatever it might be from a climate perspective, or it entrenches existing inequalities by not actually considering who else we might need to lift up and how we bring in local communities. So I do think there is that worry, but I also think there is that urgency and that pressure, and the fact that international actors are actually talking about resilience gives us that opportunity to shape that, because the recovery is unfortunately going to be slightly longer than what we would like it otherwise to be. So we do have this opportunity still.
We've spoken a bit now, Unzi's spoken a bit about the definition of resilience. It needs to be more towards this kind of general type of resilience that really deals with uncertainty and unpredictability. We've also talked a bit about, how to operationalize it and how different policy actors on the big level are operationalizing and thinking about resilience as we exit this big pandemic that has hit our global system so hard. But on the other side, a lot of people are also speaking about the importance of bringing in local communities. You mentioned that, Nisha, and I know, Salim, you've been doing a lot of work in that field and a lot of thinking about that, and also have been involved in many interesting initiatives that have been capturing the ways local communities have been responding to COVID-19. Any reflections? I mean, broadly speaking, what are we seeing from this, and what lessons can be learned from this body of work?
Thank you very much. Albert. So let me just build on Umzi's sharing of the various kinds of definitions or attributes of definitions and put my cards on the table. I come at it very normatively, which is resilience to me is a societal resilience, and the definition or attribute of whether we are becoming resilient or not resilient is how the poorest and most vulnerable people in society are dealing with problems, shocks, and impacts. And the work that I've been doing for the last 20 years has been working with some of the poorest and most vulnerable communities in the poorest and most vulnerable countries in Asia and Africa to the impacts of human-induced climate change. And I've been doing this for quite a long time. And in between, in the last year or so, we have been hit by COVID-19, which happens to have hit these particular populations extremely hard, both the virus itself, but even more so the lockdown conditions, particularly in the urban slums of cities like Dhaka, where I live, or Mumbai in India, or Lagos or Nairobi. These are the communities that have been very hard hit by the economic conditions, by the virus and the public health repercussions. And so what we have been doing with a number of partners is working with these communities with whom we have already been in touch and established relationships, is to tell their stories. And we have a series of storytelling outputs, blogs and vlogs that we call Voices from the Front Lines, from these urban centers around the world, and some rural as well, from the Solomon Islands to in the Pacific, to Bangladesh, to India, to Lagos and Nairobi. And what we are seeing from this is that these vulnerable poor populations, both urban and rural, are indeed vulnerable, but they are not helpless. They have some level of social organization, some level of capacities that can be harnessed and built on. And for external actors like researchers like myself, or donors or funders, whether they be national governments or global funding agencies, for them to look at these vulnerable populations as just as victims, to be given help and assistance as beneficiaries or even targets of support, is a very incomplete and I would say wrong framing. What we need to be realizing is that they are not necessarily just victims. They have a lot of capacity of their own, and we can learn from them, and we need to learn from them how we can assist them to build their own resilience. And in fact, I would argue that very often the poorest people in society, any given society, whether it be a rich country or a poor country, the poorest people in those countries are the ones who are much more resilient than the rich are. When the rich have their systems broken down, electricity goes or whatever they are dependent on goes, they have a hard time coping with it. But for the poor people who have this problem all the time, they actually cope with it much better and have a much more resilient attitude and capability of dealing with the issues that they have to deal with. And so there's a lot that the rich can learn from the poor in building resilience. Resilience is not at all a monopoly of the rich. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Salim. Some profound insights and lessons learned coming from the fantastic work that you're leading, and others are leading there. We have a few more minutes. I'd really like to get a bit more into the kind of some of the operational aspects and some of the examples we could give the audience here of how you can actually operationalize this term within the context that we live in now. First, just a question to you, Unzi. You've already spoken about these dimensions of resilience, the attributes of resilience. And there's always the question that pops up: can we and should we measure these dimensions of resilience in absolute or relative terms? Or should we just see them as indicators of direction of travel? Just give us a bit of your own personal thoughts, but also where the front line is. How are we doing with measuring resilience?
I think that's quite a tricky question, and yeah, I welcome anyone else to also comment on that one. I mean, I think it is also a bit in terms of what one is trying to achieve through measuring measuring resilience. I do think, in my own thinking, that trying to get a sort of a single indicator of resilience, I'm not sure is really a useful goal to go after, because I think it is a very complex and multidimensional issue. And I think one of the ways that we're exploring is actually thinking at least much more in terms of these attributes, or sort of some key dimensions and capacities, and maybe kind of focusing more in on within a specific context, how are those capacities linked to those different attributes doing. And I think often it is a bit about the whether in a particular context they are improving or going weakening, I think is a useful thing. I'm not sure to what extent it is maybe possible to get some kind of absolute measure that is comparable between different places, or at least that is meaningful in terms of what one is trying to assess. But I also think actually one of the most interesting questions is maybe also around the trade-offs between these different capacities. So I think a lot of our insights from more in-depth case study work suggests that also if you investing quite heavily in some of these capacities, say around diversity, it may have negative impacts, or actually detract or reduce your capacity in other dimensions. And I think maybe that's also quite an interesting area of future work, and yeah, both in practice and in research, is to think how those different attributes and capacities come together. But I do think that it's really important to think about them in the particular context. So I think that these attributes, I wouldn't like to put a particular indicator on, say, how would you measure diversity. I think it depends on your particular system and what also the objectives in the sense of that system is. What are you aiming to achieve? And I liked Salim's comment that, you know, maybe having a particular focus on the most marginal and people in society is actually quite a useful place to focus, in addition to looking at other aspects of the system to get a holistic understanding.
Thanks very much, Unzi. My final question before we wrap up, I have a lot of questions, but I'll save them because I want the audience to get the chance as well to direct some questions. But this one goes out jointly to Nisha and Salim. It'd be nice for us, because we've been having these conversations before as well, and we've been doing some thinking, but just to give some examples to the rest of the audience of what type of interventions do we really need to operationalize. We've talked a bit about it, but just some examples, because we speak very broadly about resilience, and that's the way we see it, this kind of broad social ecological systems perspective. But there are examples of things going on there. So what kind of interventions across these different attributes do we need to really operationalize this type of resilience? And I can start with you, Nisha, and then Salim, you can just build on that.
Sure, thanks. I mean, I think, you know, we've definitely tried to address quite a lot of these attributes before, right? Maybe to differing levels of success, or they're at different scales. And it's for, I think one of the things that I'd like to draw on from Unzi's and Salim's comments is that it's really resilience of whom for what, right? And to what. And so that contextual situation is pretty important. I think that's what's guided previous interventions and support as well. So for example, I mentioned safety nets before, and the fact that social safety nets or hunger safety net programs are becoming one of the tools how we reach the most marginal, vulnerable, but also general populations, right? So if you think about the systems that have been activated in the last couple of months, so for example, you know, Kenya's hunger safety net program has been used not just in times of climate-related shocks, but also now to activate during the COVID pandemic to reach the most vulnerable. So if you're talking about redundancies, then those are the sort of systems that, you know, that could really be useful in not just in times of non-crises, but also during crises. The other piece that I would point out is sort of the community empowerment aspect, and the fact that there are a lot of village and savings loans associations that have really helped funnel to include, I think, communities into the financial system and to access different sort of products, but also actually leverage power to actually invest in sort of projects that are useful for them, right? So the India's village savings and loan associations are sort of operate across 35 countries, for example. So I think there are examples here that we could definitely use to actually operationalize and actually implement, I think, change within the system. So I'll stop there. Celine.
Thank you very much, Anisha. So let me just share a little bit of our own experience. And I speak now as an academic, a professor in a university where we have researchers, faculty, lots and lots of students, extremely intelligent and energetic students who are a potential force for engagement, and partnerships that we have developed with two major institutions, one being the Global Shack Dwellers International, who are operating in slums in about 300 cities and towns across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and with BRAC, which is the largest NGO in Bangladesh, but also happens now to be the largest NGO in the world, operating in about a dozen least developed countries, again in Asia and Africa. And so with these two groups of partners who have very well established local level communities with whom they have been working in a development context for quite a number of years, we have been bringing in from our side university networks. In Bangladesh, we have a network called Gobeshona, which is a Bangla word for research. And we also have a network of universities across the least developed countries called the LDC Universities Consortium on Climate Change, where, as I said, we can bring in faculty and students to engage with these communities, and in the context of the vulnerability to climate change. So climate change vulnerability is a relatively new thing for them. They have to learn about it. They have to learn what climate change is, and then how they are vulnerable, and then what they can do about it in terms of building their adaptation capacity and resilience. And in that context, our input is knowledge and sharing, and we learn from them. We learn from them, they learn from us. It's very much a two-way learning experience, at the end of which we try and come up with strategies that can enable them to make themselves more resilient over time. And the aspect of how do we measure resilience, to answer Albert's earlier question, is very much a self-driven answer. It's for them to set their own targets or their own aspirations of how they want to develop their own resilience, and to then measure it themselves over a period of time. It's not measurement by external actors or donors or others coming and evaluating the resilience of people, but people measuring their own resilience increase over time. So they are measuring over time. They're not comparing one group with another group. That's the job of external actors. But for themselves, they are measuring their own progress over time, setting their own metrics for what is progress, and then measuring that progress over time and seeing whether they are moving in the right direction or not, and if not, how to make corrections going forward. So it's very much an operational modality, methodology, knowledge generating, and experiential learning exercise. And if I can just also make a quick advertisement, we every year in January, we have a major conference on what we call locally led adaptation. It used to be based in Bangladesh and people had to come here to participate, but from next January, from the 21st to the 24th of January, we are making it a global virtual event, and we would be very happy for anybody who wants to engage with us to engage and participate in that process at that time. Anybody working on locally led adaptation would be most welcome to come and share, run sessions or join and learn about what other people are doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Salim. Thank you, Nisha. Thank you, Unzi. What we'll do now is, like I mentioned at the beginning, I'll assign you all to random breakout groups, and then you'll have 5 minutes to collectively just do some really quick reflections on the session, but mainly focus on distilling some key questions together as a group. and then just assign someone to forward that question either through the chat function or by raising your hand. You can do it verbally through audio when we come back. So 5 minutes now, and I'll just be doing the breakout groups now. If you get one of the panel participants in your breakout sessions, they'll be muted. Don't ask them the questions now. Save it for the group, okay? Okay.
Hello. Are you able to hear me?
Hi, everyone.
Yeah, hi.
Yes, I also hear you fine.
Okay, cool. I think, Onsi, I guess you're supposed to be quiet.
Exactly. I'm going to go on mute and just listen.
Okay, that sounds good. Does anyone have any thoughts on any questions that we should ask the panel?
I must say that I joined the session a bit towards the middle of the session, so I might not have covered all of it. But in general, the thought was on measuring the resilience, as Unsi you were talking about, and also Salim. So I mean, how exactly, or there was no clear-cut answer, or is there as we move forward? Can we come up with some recommendation on this stopping point? As always, I mean, do we have some real actions that we can take, for instance, where we can to some degree measure the resilience? I mean, when we say that, okay, we assume the poor and vulnerable to measure it themselves, for instance, as they progress. I don't know how if you have some thoughts on that, for instance. We'll see if you can say something.
Yeah, I don't think Onsi is going to answer right now.
Later on, yeah.
Back in the group, but I think that's a great question that we can pose when we get
Thanks for the warning, so I can start thinking.
Yeah. I think that's an excellent question to use. If there are some real actions that we can take to measure.
We can, exactly. And also given the COVID plus climate condition that we are in, and we talk about the resilience recovery, but for instance, when it comes to Africa, how off placed is the continent when it comes to the recovery plan? Because there were green recovery talks going on, but at this point the focus is now on COVID, and then how do you integrate this green recovery with the backdrop of COVID? Is it feasible? Is it possible for them to achieve it? And also the fact that the country is becoming a bit more nationalistic, if I may use the word, when it comes to the recovery and building back better. How does the developmental aid or developmental projects, how does it look moving forward? Resilience is kind of a product, I would say, in my imagination, as we do the developmental project in, for instance, Africa, in order to achieve resilience, but now with more of a nationalistic perspective, as opposed to the multinationalistic angle. How will it reflect on the resilience building?
I think that's also an excellent question to pose. Is there any specific country in Africa you're thinking about, or are you just thinking of the continent as a whole?
Well, I work in East Africa, so it's
Okay.
mostly Kenya and Tanzania and Zambia, a little bit that I focus, but it's more on a general question.
Okay.
So either you will be presenting the questions then.
Yeah, I can present these back.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's time for us to go back.
Yes. Thank you.
So people are popping back in, and it would be fantastic if everyone can just mute their microphones as they pop back into plenary again, just to make things a bit more.
Bueno, hemos vuelto y les pediría que silenciasen los micrófonos para volver a la sesión plenaria.
There we go. Great. This was a bit of a nice experiment. Hopefully you have a chance to just say hi to one another and also
Vale, este experimento yo creo que ha sido muy bueno, que hemos tenido
on some of the things that have been said by the panelists. We can basically start. I mean, you have different venues to air your questions. I mean, you can use the chat button, the chat window down to your bottom right, or you can.
Creo que tenéis
you can just,
una imagen de chat.
I'm just trying to mute the Spanish interpreter. That's great. Thanks. Or you could just raise your hand through the little button. If you click on the participant toolbar down there, and then you see the list of participants, you can actually choose raise your hand, and that then shows that you want to ask a question. But all right, anyone wants to go first? Otherwise, I can continue. I have a bunch of questions, but I'd really like it to open up to the audience. Okay, well, I can start. Oh, go ahead.
I can ask a question from our group.
Yeah, go ahead. Yes, go ahead, Ida.
Sorry, I don't have a blue hand as I'm a co-host. So we were speaking a bit about measuring resilience, and I know you touched upon this a bit in the last panel, but we were wondering if there are any more real concrete actions that you can take to measure resilience.
I'll open up to anyone who wants to go from the panelists. Unzi, you've already reflected a bit about this. Maybe we can give Nisha, Salim the chance to have a first stab at this, and then you can add any additional thoughts you have on this.
Sure, maybe I'll start and then Salim, please do come in, or Unzi, if you disagree with what I say. I think one of the things that we've already started doing in some fashion is measuring the different attributes of resilience, right? So I think Unzi mentioned 5 around redundancy, diversity, and adaptive learning. But in all of those aspects, we are tracking that in sort of interventions in government systems, communities actually evaluating themselves in terms of how they're doing, right? So if you look at what we've done in terms of monitoring and evaluating. So I do think that we have an understanding of the different attributes, but I don't think in terms of what Unzi was saying, in terms of how they relate to each other, or what the systemic version of resilience is, and whether there's even such a thing, to be honest, right? And I think that's a question that we have to ask ourselves as to, is there that end goal, or which I think we all want to reduce anything that we want to say as a concept to that one indicator. And I think that will always probably be elusive, and that's probably actually something that we might want to avoid, because it gives a very one-dimensional view of what resilience is and for whom and when. So I do think that we have tools to do so now, but not in the way that what most of us want to do, probably, if that makes sense. Salim?
Sure. Thank you very much, Nisha. So I belong to the bottom-up definitions and measuring group, if you like. And to me, it isn't something that we all have to agree that's a universal. It is horses for courses. And as I said, for communities of practice to define what they want to do, what they want to achieve, how they want to get there, and then find their own means of measuring progress over time. Then, after that has been done, that is the primary task, we can then think about, are there lessons that are generic across case studies about different places around the world, or different places even within a country, that one can take together and aggregate and assess whether a country is becoming more resilient or not, or a city or a town compared to others. This bottom-up approach to aggregating across within a country, across communities, and then across countries within continents, and then across continents to a global goal. This is a particular opportunity as well as a dilemma for us who work on the adaptation side of the equation rather than the resilience side of the equation, because in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, in the Paris Agreement, in Article 7, we have actually agreed 5 years ago that we will have a global goal on adaptation. But we weren't able to agree what that global goal is. And we still haven't agreed what that global goal is, because it's a very, very difficult thing to aggregate to the global level what is really essentially extremely disassociated, locally relevant adaptation actions. And in my view, the time is now right for the various groups that are working on this, both on adaptation as well as resilience, to try and come up with some proxy measurements that can be used for the time being. We won't be perfect, because if it had been perfect, we would have known how to do it 5 years ago. But let us see if we can come up with some ways of defining what it is. Race to Resilience by the Climate Champions is one thing that they are pushing forward. I myself like to use the term zero vulnerability to match the zero emissions sort of meme that we have already created that has got traction. That's our goal. Again, good questions on how do you measure it? Can you achieve it? I don't know the answers to that, but I'd like to have that as a goal for everybody to achieve, and then find out ways in which we measure it and achieve it. So I am in favor of having 100 flowers bloom in terms of what we want to do, rather than have one imposed top-down definition, and then see whether there are common elements to that that we can share. And to me, the criteria that should allow us to judge is useful information. Are we learning from each other useful things that enable us each to do more and do better, to speed up our own activities and to do it at bigger and bigger scales? If we are achieving that, then those are good ways of sharing knowledge and experience, and not necessarily with a hidebound definition that everybody has to abide by and agree to, and you can't allow any kind of deviation from. So anyway, that's where I stand on this issue.
Nisha, thanks, Salim. Unzi, I don't know, do you want to add anything to that?
Maybe just to also echo that I also very much support the kind of experimenting with multiple different ways of doing this. I think everything that we know about, also that it's a fast developing space and there's changes in concepts, I think having a broader diversity of things will help us hopefully move in a better direction. But maybe also just to reflect that in some of the work that we've done here in South Africa, I think you see this issue around measurement is embedded within questions around assessment and the purposes of assessment. And I think one of the things that, or distinctions that has been quite useful in our work is this distinction between formative versus summative assessments, and whether the purpose of the assessment is actually for people in the system to learn and then improve their capacity to respond, which I think is also what Salim and Nisha have been focusing on to some extent, versus is the purpose of the assessment by, say, an external funder to assess improvements or to compare places amongst each other. And I think those are very different kind of purposes. And I think a lot of our work has also been more about, in a sense, empowering and people themselves to reflect on and think and learn about their system. And so that the measurements and the way they're approaching that is really with that goal in mind, which is very different, maybe to the need also for kind of larger scale sort of summative assessments across projects. And how we approach that kind of need for these more comparison-based assessments, I think, is a big question. And I think it's especially there where we should definitely think about some multiple ways that we might approach that in a meaningful way. And I think maybe a big thing is to keep in mind is, I mean, that would be sort of an extreme end, but we wouldn't want to fall in the kind of trap of sort of the GDP indicator, where you get one very powerful indicator, which just by the nature of what you're actually looking at is a complex system. And so if you use one indicator, you're getting one kind of perspective on that. And then we know from complex systems that people start gaming the indicator. So the indicator itself starts skewing the system. And so I think that's the kind of dynamic one wants to avoid.
Thanks, Unzi. Thanks to all. I'm just seeing here now that there's some comments in the chat that the magic hand of Zoom cannot be seen. We apologize for that. I don't know why. But then you can use the chat, like Shamala Naidu, who's directing a question, which builds a bit upon what you've been talking about now, about the tension between complexity and measurement, how you kind of resolve that. You've touched upon that. But there's also the question of a lot of funders, a lot of governments, a lot of constituents also demanding results. How do you do that if you don't have ways of measuring progress or results? How do you prove that actually this intervention that we say is building resilience is actually doing what it's supposed to be doing, building resilience? Any one of the panelists wants to have a crack at that?
Maybe
Nisha.
Start us off.
Yes.
Here. I think this is exactly what Unzi was saying, which is, what are we measuring for, whether that is, self-community learning or even government learning to an extent versus an external actor to that country learning. I think the other piece here is that, we should probably talk about the time dimension of resilience, right? Resilience we don't achieve that in 6 months or a year or 5 years even. It is this very dynamic concept in that sense, and I might be resilient today but not tomorrow kind of issue as well. And so in some sense, I think we need to ask what Sharmila, I think you and your group were probably talking about, is partially this balance also of understanding when and where and how this is actually useful. And there are things that might work in the short term but that don't in the long term. So I think all of this really points to the fact that we need to continually assess this, that it isn't a point in time concept, and again, going back to the balance between all the different attributes, I'm not sure, I guess I'm not really answering the question except making it more complex here. But I think that's what we all struggle with from even a practitioner point of view, right? In translating this is, there is in any version of the measurement question, I think we run into challenges of what are we actually showcasing here. But I don't know if my other fellow panelists differ on that.
They seem to be nodding in agreement, Nisha. That's a good sign. I see one person that has managed to get the little blue Zoom hand to work is Sibel Kirosh. Sibel, do you have a question?
Yeah. I don't know how I did. I couldn't take my hand down though, but very quickly. So one question, I guess, because you all have been lifting the importance of like thinking of resilience in a very concrete way, like resilience to what, right? And sort of the context importance. So I'm just wondering, like, I mean, there's a backside of that. And there is that we actually are investing in very specific types of resilience actions targeted to certain challenges or disturbances. And that is related with those trade-offs that you talk about, Ansi. So like, we are doing those investments and we might actually be losing resilience for other sorts of disturbances. I guess that's like quite obvious now with the COVID crisis, for instance, like we're putting so much effort in like, you know, responding to this and building resilience to this sort of crisis. So what will be sort of the backside of that? And what I wanted to ask you, and this is a really tricky question, but it is like, how do you do that balance? Like, yes, context is important, resilience to what, but then like, you want to be prepared for the unknown. Like you don't want to lose this general component of resilience. So how do you sort of, you know, include that in your, yeah, I guess that's my question.
And maybe I can come with some initial thoughts. I mean, I actually think that in general, when we're talking about resilience, we're probably actually more interested in general resilience, which is resilience against multiple kinds of things, rather than against specific kind of shocks. And I guess when I was thinking more about context, I'm thinking more in terms of what kind of, how would you build the capacity? And I think that you know, if you say, okay, we want to try to build resilience to a bunch of different potential shocks that could hit our particular system, but then it is about, so if we want to invest in kind of diversity or in learning, or that those things, like they're general principles, but how you actually then invest in them in your particular system obviously depends on what system it is and what's already there. And I think also there, in terms of saying you're going to invest in, for instance, you know, enhancing redundancy or diversity could have implications for the extent to which you can, you know, maybe address equity or some of the other issues. So I think it's also in that respect that there's some important trade-offs to consider.
Great, thanks, Unzi. I can, yeah, Salim and Nisha, maybe you both can reflect maybe quickly before we wrap up. Be great.
Sure,
yeah.
Sure. So one other way, thank you very much for the question, Sibel. One other way to think about it in my sort of framing is to link the local to the national to the global. And I think, you know, that in a way expands the universe of things we have to be resilient to. The local situation has to be, people in the local area have to be resilient to a variety of shocks and issues. Then going out to the nation scale, countries have to do that. The national governments have to be responsible for, and then globally. And I think the COVID-19 crisis of this year has demonstrated that no country can do this alone. It's all countries are going to have to either come out at the other end all right or not come out at the other end, and no country is going to be able to protect themselves from recontamination going forward. Climate change is extremely similar. It's a global phenomena. We're going to have global solutions, and we need to have a global mindset to do that. And to me, that really is the overarching intellectual challenge for us to take this scales from the very local to the national to the global and embed these concepts at functional ways in these different arenas, and think of ourselves as both local citizens of wherever we happen to be living, and then citizens of our own city, town, locality, and our country, and the whole globe. And the global citizenship is an extremely important attribute that we now need to be thinking about, all of us, as citizens of planet Earth. Thank you.
And Nisha, do you want to add to the things that have already been said?
I think it's really hard to come after Salim ever. But no, I mean, I think that sort of really covers the gamut. I think part of it is that, again, maybe just repeating what Unzi said, that resilience is what we've learned perhaps from this experience in the last couple of months, is that what we do to be resilient to one situation is likely similar to what we might do for other situations. So in that sense, we no longer should be making decisions for looking at one type of resilience, right? And in one type of shock. And I think that's probably one of the biggest takeaways, that some of the systems that we put in place weren't for a pandemic at all, right? They were for very different things, and we've used that and leveraged that to guide us in the next couple of shocks. So I'll stop there. Thanks, Albert.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Unzi. Thank you, Salim. Thank you, Nisha, for some really profound reflections. I mean, clearly we are, like Salim mentions, in a new time. We talk about this being the Anthropocene, where everyone is in each other's backyards, and the new coming risk landscape that we're facing will really require a systemic type of resilience, which encompasses the local and the global in ways that it hasn't done before. There are many more questions that have been popping up on the chat. Unfortunately, we need to wrap things up. And I've learned not too long ago, just a couple of weeks ago, that there's actually an official Zoom clapping now where everyone puts on their cameras and then we wave like this. And I think that'd be a nice way to show our appreciation to the panelists who've been giving us some really nice insights. So everyone put on their camera. I'll give you a couple of minutes, a few seconds, I mean, or you can just do like Kristen, you can do it virtually as well. Okay, and then 1, 2, 3.
Very good, thank you.
And thank you everyone for joining, and excuse any technical glitches in the beginning. It was a bit hectic, but I think it really went smoothly. And have a nice continued conference and all the other interesting sessions that I'll be joining as well. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.